Before we dive into the largest cavalry charge in human history, let me ask you something. What happens when the Ottoman Empire, the most powerful Islamic state on earth, brings 250,000 soldiers to the gates of Vienna with orders to conquer Christian Europe once and for all? What happens when the city's 30,000 defenders are starving, their walls crumbling, their ammunition running out, and no help is coming? Logic says Vienna falls. History says Europe becomes Ottoman. But on September 12, 1683, a Polish king named John Sobieski led 18,000 winged hussars down a mountain outside Vienna and launched the largest cavalry charge ever recorded. They smashed through Ottoman lines like a steel avalanche, destroyed the siege camps, and shattered the Ottoman army so completely that the empire never seriously threatened Europe again. This isn't a story about heroic last stands or miraculous interventions. This is a story about geopolitics, military logistics, and one perfectly timed cavalry charge that changed the trajectory of Western civilization. No mythology, no religious propaganda, just strategy, timing, and the cold mathematics of how 18,000 horsemen destroyed an empire's ambitions in a single afternoon. If this sounds like history worth your time, hit that like button and drop a comment. Now let's go back over 300 years and watch the Winged Hussars save Europe. To understand how we got to Vienna, you need to understand what the Ottoman Empire was in 1683. This wasn't some declining power clinging to past glory. This was one of the three dominant empires on earth, alongside Qing China and Mughal India. The Ottomans controlled territory stretching from Algeria to Iraq, from Hungary to Yemen. They conquered Constantinople in 1453, ending the Byzantine Empire. They'd crushed the Mamluks in Egypt. They fought the Safavid Persians to a standstill. For 2 centuries, they'd been expanding into Europe, conquering the Balkans, threatening the Mediterranean, and pushing the frontier of Islamic civilization deeper into Christian territory. By the late 1600s, Ottoman forces had reached the gates of Vienna twice before. In 1529, Suleiman the Magnificent besieged the city but failed to take it. In 1683, the Ottoman Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa Pasha was determined to finish what Suleiman had started: conquer Vienna, break into Central Europe, force the Holy Roman Empire to its knees, spread Ottoman power to the Rhine and beyond. Kara Mustafa was not a patient man. He'd risen to power through ambition, ruthlessness, and connections to the Ottoman court. In 1683, Sultan Mehmed IV gave him command of the largest Ottoman army assembled in decades. Exact numbers are debated, but modern estimates suggest around 140,000 regular Ottoman troops, plus another 60,000 to 80,000 auxiliaries, conscripts, and support personnel. Call it 200,000 men. They marched north from Istanbul in the spring of 1683, moving through Ottoman-controlled Balkans, into Hungary, and toward Vienna. This wasn't a raiding party. This was an invasion force meant to break European resistance permanently. The army brought siege artillery, engineers, sappers trained in mining fortifications, and enough supplies to sustain a prolonged siege. Kara Mustafa believed he could take Vienna, then use it as a base to conquer the rest of the Holy Roman Empire. He was gambling his career, his reputation, and possibly his life on this campaign. In Ottoman culture, failure at this level was often punished with execution. Vienna was the capital of Habsburg Austria and one of the most strategically important cities in Europe. Control Vienna, and you control access to Central Europe. The Danube River, which flows through Vienna, was a major trade and military route. Lose Vienna, and the entire Habsburg realm becomes vulnerable. Emperor Leopold, I understood this. But in 1683, the Habsburgs were not in a position to defend their capital with overwhelming force. The empire was dealing with internal problems, strained finances, and limited military resources. The standing garrison in Vienna numbered around 15,000 soldiers plus whatever militia and armed citizens could be mustered. Maybe 30,000 defenders total, against 200,000 Ottomans. The math was not good, So Leopold did two things. First, he appointed Count Ernst Rudiger von Starhemberg as the military commander of Vienna's defense. Starhemberg was a professional soldier, experienced, competent, and unflinching. Second, Leopold himself fled the city. This wasn't cowardice, it was pragmatism. If the emperor was captured or killed, the entire empire's legitimacy would collapse. So Leopold left, took the court with him, and set about trying to rally reinforcements from across Europe. The Ottoman army arrived outside Vienna on July 14, 1683. They surrounded the city, cut off supply routes, and began preparing for a siege. Vienna's fortifications were strong, thick walls reinforced with bastions designed to withstand cannon fire. A moat, multiple defensive layers, but the walls weren't invincible. Ottoman engineers began digging siege trenches, moving closer to the walls under cover of earth and timber. Meanwhile, Ottoman sappers started mining operations. This was the primary Ottoman siege tactic: dig tunnels under the walls, pack them with gunpowder, detonate the charges, and blow sections of the wall apart. Then storm through the breaches before defenders could rebuild. It was slow, methodical, and effective. The Viennese defenders could see the trenches advancing, could hear the mining operations below their feet, but couldn't stop them. Countermining, where defenders dig their own tunnels to intercept enemy mines, was attempted but only partially successful. The Ottomans kept digging. Inside Vienna, conditions deteriorated rapidly. The city had stockpiled food, but feeding 30,000 people plus thousands of civilians who hadn't evacuated required enormous supplies. Weeks passed, then months. Food ran low, Starhemberg imposed rationing, people began starving, disease spread, as it always did in besieged cities where sanitation collapsed and bodies piled up. Ammunition started running out. Gunpowder was conserved for critical defensive actions. The garrison couldn't afford to waste a single shot. Meanwhile, Ottoman artillery pounded the walls day and night. Sections crumbled. Defenders repaired them as fast as they could, but the damage accumulated faster than repairs could keep up. By late August, multiple breaches had been blown in the walls. Ottoman forces launched assault after assault, trying to storm through the gaps and overwhelm the defenders. Each attack was repelled, but at horrific cost. Casualties mounted. Defenders who died couldn't be replaced. The Ottomans could bring fresh troops forward. The Viennese couldn't. Time was running out. Outside Vienna, Leopold desperately tried to assemble a relief force. He sent envoys to every major Christian power in Europe. Most ignored him. France, the most powerful Catholic kingdom, was actually allied with the Ottomans against the Habsburgs. Louis XIV saw the Ottoman invasion as an opportunity to weaken his Habsburg rivals, so no help from France. Spain was dealing with its own problems. England was uninterested in continental wars. Leopold's only real hope was the Holy Roman Empire's German states and Poland. The German states contributed troops, but slowly. They were fragmented, each state operating independently, and coordinating them was nearly impossible, but Poland was different. Poland-Lithuania was one of the great powers of Eastern Europe, and its king, John III Sobieski, understood that if Vienna fell, Poland would be next on the Ottoman target list. So Sobieski committed to rescuing Vienna, not out of charity or religious solidarity, though those factors played a role. Out of cold strategic calculation, stop the Ottomans at Vienna or fight them in Poland later. Better to fight at Vienna with allies than alone in Poland. Sobieski assembled a relief force of around 27,000 Polish troops, including 18,000 cavalry. Most of that cavalry were Winged Hussars, Poland's elite heavy cavalry units. These weren't just armored horsemen, they were the most feared cavalry force in Europe. Winged Hussars wore distinctive wings attached to their backs or saddles, made from feathers and wood, which made a terrifying sound when they charged and made the riders look larger and more intimidating. More importantly, they were trained to charge in disciplined formations, maintain cohesion, and break enemy lines through sheer momentum and shock. They carried long lances that could punch through armor and infantry formations. They were trained to fight as heavy cavalry, not skirmishers. Their job was to hit the enemy at full speed and shatter them, and they were very, very good at it. Sobieski's force linked up with Imperial and German troops assembling near Vienna. The combined relief army numbered around 70,000 men. Still outnumbered by the Ottomans, but enough to attempt a battle. The relief force approached Vienna from the northwest, moving through the Vienna woods, forested hills that provided cover from Ottoman scouts. On September 11, 1683, they reached the Kahlenberg, a mountain overlooking Vienna from the northwest. From there, they could see the city below, surrounded by Ottoman siege lines, smoke rising from fires, the walls breached and crumbling. Sobieski surveyed the battlefield. He understood immediately what needed to happen. The Ottoman army was spread out in siege formations, focused on the city walls, not positioned for a major field battle. Their camps stretched for miles, organized for siege logistics, not defense against a relief force. If the Christian army could descend from the Kahlenberg and hit the Ottoman siege lines before they could regroup and form a proper defensive line, the shock and momentum could break them. It was risky. If the Ottomans formed up and counterattacked effectively, the relief force could be destroyed. But Sobieski saw the opportunity: attack fast, hit hard, and break the siege before Kara Mustafa could adapt. Kara Mustafa knew the relief force was approaching. Ottoman scouts had reported it, but he made a critical miscalculation. He believed he had time. Time to take Vienna, time to reposition his forces, time to prepare a defense. He ordered his troops to continue assaulting Vienna's walls, to break through before the relief army arrived. If he could conquer the city before they attacked, the relief force would have nothing to relieve. The siege would be over, and the Ottomans could turn their full strength against the Christian army. But Vienna didn't fall. Kahlenberg and his defenders held, barely. The walls were breached in multiple places. Ottoman troops had penetrated the outer defenses in some sections. The garrison was at the breaking point, but they held, and Kara Mustafa ran out of time. On the morning of September 12, 1683, the Christian relief army began descending from the Kahlenberg. The attack was coordinated in phases. Infantry moved forward first, engaging Ottoman forward positions and securing ground. Artillery bombarded Ottoman lines. The plan was for the infantry to fix the Ottoman forces in place, while the cavalry, held in reserve, waited for the decisive moment to charge. The battle spread across the entire plain northwest of Vienna. Imperial and German troops pushed against Ottoman defenses. Fighting was brutal, hand-to-hand in many places, casualties mounting on both sides, but the Ottomans were caught in a bad position. They were organized for siege operations, not a major field battle. Redeploying troops from the siege lines to face the relief army created gaps and confusion. Units that had been focused on Vienna's walls for weeks suddenly had to turn around and fight a different enemy coming from a different direction. Command coherence broke down. By afternoon, the Ottoman lines were under massive pressure but hadn't broken. Kara Mustafa attempted to rally his forces to concentrate them into a coherent defensive formation. But his army was stretched thin, scattered across miles of siege lines, and couldn't consolidate fast enough. The Christian infantry kept pushing, grinding forward, but they couldn't achieve a decisive breakthrough. That's when Sobieski made his decision: release the cavalry. The Winged Hussars and other cavalry units had been held in reserve all day, waiting. Now Sobieski gave the order: charge. 18,000 Polish cavalry, with Sobieski personally leading from the front, began their advance. They formed up into a massive wedge formation, lances forward, and started moving downhill from the Kahlenberg toward the Ottoman camp. Cavalry charges work because of physics. A horse weighing 1,000 pounds, moving at 25 or 30 miles per hour, carries enormous kinetic energy. A rider on that horse, armored and wielding a lance, multiplies that energy into a devastating impact. Now multiply that by 18,000. That's millions of pounds of flesh, steel, and momentum concentrated into a single spear point aimed at one section of enemy line. The sound alone was terrifying. Thousands of hooves pounding the ground, the distinctive whistling sound of the winged hussars, feathers, the shouting of riders, the creak of armor and leather. Ottoman soldiers on the receiving end saw a wall of cavalry descending from the hills and knew what was about to happen. Some tried to form defensive lines. Infantry tried to set pikes and brace for impact. It didn't matter. The winged hussars hit the Ottoman lines at full speed and obliterated them. Lances punched through infantry formations. Horses trampled men who couldn't get out of the way. The momentum of the charge carried the cavalry deep into Ottoman positions before anyone could mount an effective defense. Once the lances broke or were dropped, the hussars drew sabers and continued fighting at close range. But the real damage was psychological. The Ottoman troops, who had been under pressure all day, who were exhausted from weeks of siege operations, who were caught out of position and disorganized, saw their lines shattered in seconds and panicked. Units that might have held against infantry broke and ran when hit by the cavalry. Once one unit broke, panic spread. Neighboring units saw their comrades fleeing and followed. What had been an organized army disintegrated into a mob of terrified soldiers trying to escape. The winged hussars pursued, cutting down anyone they caught, driving deeper into the Ottoman camp. The charge didn't stop at the first line. It kept going. The cavalry smashed through Ottoman defensive positions, overran artillery emplacements, crashed into the camp itself, where tents, supply wagons, and non-combatants were concentrated. The Ottoman camp was enormous, housing tens of thousands of people and months of supplies. The cavalry turned it into chaos. Soldiers abandoned equipment and fled. Camp followers scattered. Fires started as tents were knocked over and lamps ignited fabric. The entire Ottoman siege operation, which had been grinding toward victory for 2 months, collapsed in under an hour. Kara Mustafa tried to organize a defense, tried to rally his troops, but it was hopeless. His army was broken. By evening, Ottoman forces were in full retreat, fleeing south toward Hungary, abandoning everything they couldn't carry. The siege was over. Vienna was saved. Inside the city, the defenders watched in disbelief as the Ottoman army disintegrated. For weeks, they'd been certain they were going to die. The walls were breached. Food was gone. Ammunition nearly exhausted. They'd been preparing for a final, suicidal defense when the Ottomans broke through. Instead, they watched the siege lift, watched their enemies flee, watched the relief army enter the camp the Ottomans had abandoned. Kahlenberg and his garrison had held just long enough. If they'd collapsed even a day earlier, the relief force would have arrived to find Vienna occupied and fortified, and the entire battle would have been different. But they held. And because they held, Sobieski's charge worked. Everything connected. The defenders' refusal to break gave Sobieski the opportunity to destroy the besiegers. The immediate aftermath was a slaughter. As Ottoman forces retreated, Christian cavalry pursued for miles, cutting down stragglers and isolated units. Exact casualty figures are impossible to determine with precision, but estimates suggest the Ottomans lost between 15,000 and 25,000 dead in the battle and subsequent rout. More were captured. Thousands more deserted and never returned to Ottoman service. The Christian relief force suffered casualties too, several thousand dead and wounded, but proportionally far fewer. More importantly, they'd captured the entire Ottoman camp. Tents, artillery, food supplies, weapons, treasure, everything. The loot was staggering. Kara Mustafa had brought enormous wealth with him, expecting to distribute it as rewards after conquering Vienna. Instead, it fell into Christian hands. Sobieski personally claimed the Ottoman Grand Vizier's tent, a massive structure that became a trophy of the victory. Kara Mustafa's fate was sealed. He retreated with the remnants of his army back to Ottoman territory, knowing he'd failed catastrophically. Sultan Mehmed IV, who had authorized the campaign and expected triumph, was furious. Kara Mustafa tried to explain, tried to blame subordinates, tried to argue he'd been betrayed by insufficient support. None of it mattered. Failure of this magnitude required a scapegoat. On December 25, 1683, less than 4 months after the battle, Kara Mustafa was executed by strangulation in Belgrade on the Sultan's orders. His head was sent to the Sultan in Istanbul as proof of his death. That's Ottoman politics. Win and you're celebrated, lose and you die. Kara Mustafa gambled everything on Vienna and lost everything when the gamble failed. Let's talk about why the Winged Hussars charge succeeded, because cavalry charges don't automatically win battles. Throughout history, cavalry charges have failed as often as they've succeeded, sometimes with catastrophic results for the cavalry. Charging into prepared infantry with pikes or firearms can result in horses being impaled or shot before they reach the enemy line. Charging uphill or across broken terrain slows horses and negates momentum. Charging against well-organized formations with strong morale often just results in cavalry bouncing off without breaking through. So why did this charge work? Several factors. First, terrain. The Kahlenberg provided a downhill slope that added speed and momentum to the charge. Gravity assisted. Second, timing. The charge came after hours of infantry combat had already exhausted and disorganized Ottoman forces. They weren't fresh troops in strong positions. They were tired, scattered, and under pressure. Third, scale. 18,000 cavalry is an overwhelming mass. Even if Ottoman units had been fresh and organized, concentrating enough force to stop that many horsemen would have been nearly impossible. Fourth, psychological impact. The Winged Hussars' reputation preceded them. Ottoman soldiers knew who they were and what they could do. Seeing them charging created panic before contact was even made. Compare this to other famous cavalry charges in history. The charge of the Light Brigade at Balaclava in 1854 failed disastrously because the British cavalry charged into prepared Russian artillery and infantry positions with no support and no realistic objective. Pickett's charge at Gettysburg in 1863 failed because Confederate infantry charged across open ground into entrenched Union positions with overwhelming firepower. The Winged Hussars at Vienna succeeded because they charged at the right time, in the right place, against an enemy that wasn't positioned to stop them. That's not luck. That's Sobieski reading the battlefield, understanding the moment, and committing his most powerful asset when it would have maximum effect. Cavalry is a weapon that only works once per battle. Once committed, cavalry can't easily reform and charge again. So you wait for the decisive moment, then you use it. Sobieski waited all day, then struck when the Ottoman army was most vulnerable. Perfect timing. The strategic consequences of Vienna were enormous. The Ottoman Empire never seriously threatened Central Europe again. The defeat shattered the myth of Ottoman invincibility that had intimidated European powers for decades. It also marked the beginning of a long Ottoman decline. In the years following Vienna, European powers went on the offensive. The Great Turkish War, which lasted until 1699, saw the Habsburgs reconquer Hungary and push the Ottomans back into the Balkans. The Ottoman Empire, which had been expanding for centuries, was now contracting. Economically, militarily, politically, the empire entered a period of stagnation that would eventually lead to its collapse in the early 20th century. Vienna was the turning point. The moment when European powers realized the Ottomans could be beaten, and beaten decisively. For Poland, Vienna was a moment of glory, but also a warning of future problems. Sobieski had saved Vienna and was celebrated as a hero across Christian Europe. But Poland itself was entering a period of decline. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth's political system, which gave enormous power to the nobility and required unanimous consent for major decisions, made effective governance nearly impossible. Internal divisions, economic problems, and external pressures from Russia, Prussia, and Austria would eventually lead to Poland being partitioned and erased from the map in the late 1700s. Sobieski himself died in 1696, having spent the last years of his reign dealing with political infighting and foreign threats. He saved Vienna, but he couldn't save Poland. History has few ironies sharper than that. The king who rescued Europe spent his final years watching his own kingdom crumble. Let's examine the logistics of the siege and relief operation, because wars are won by logistics as much as tactics. The Ottoman army marched from Istanbul to Vienna over 1,000 miles and had to be supplied continuously. Food, ammunition, equipment, replacement troops all had to be transporting across that distance. The Ottomans relied on supply lines stretching back through Hungary and the Balkans. Those lines were vulnerable. Christian forces, particularly Hungarian rebels and Austrian irregulars, constantly harassed Ottoman supply convoys. That harassment didn't stop the siege, but it made it more difficult and costly. Meanwhile, the relief force had shorter supply lines and could move faster. Sobieski's march from Poland to Vienna covered hundreds of miles, but his army moved quickly and arrived when needed. If he'd been delayed even a few days, Vienna would have fallen before he arrived. Timing mattered. Both sides understood that logistics determined the strategic possibilities. The Ottomans couldn't sustain the siege indefinitely if relief forces threatened their position. The Christians couldn't assemble a relief force if they ran out of time. It was a race. The Christians won. The role of Habsburg diplomacy also deserves recognition. Leopold's envoys worked tirelessly to assemble the relief coalition. German states contributed troops, though fewer than hoped. Poland provided the critical mass of cavalry that made the victory possible, but the diplomacy was fragile. If France had supported the Habsburgs instead of tolerating the Ottoman invasion, the relief force could have been much larger. If Poland had decided the risk was too great and stayed home, Vienna would have fallen. Leopold's diplomatic efforts created the conditions for victory, but just barely. The coalition was always on the edge of falling apart. One more delay, one more setback, and it would have collapsed. That vulnerability is typical of coalition warfare. Multiple powers with different interests trying to cooperate rarely work smoothly. At Vienna, it worked just well enough. The human cost of the siege was staggering. Inside Vienna, thousands of civilians and soldiers died from starvation, disease, and combat. Exact figures are unknown, but estimates suggest at least 5,000 deaths among the defenders. Outside, both Ottoman and Christian forces suffered heavy casualties during the siege and battle. The Ottoman retreat was particularly brutal. Thousands died fleeing back to Ottoman territory, either killed by pursuing forces or succumbing to exhaustion and hunger. For the common soldiers on all sides, Vienna was hell. Noble commanders like Sobieski and Kahlenberg are remembered. The thousands of anonymous soldiers who did the actual fighting and dying are mostly forgotten, but wars are fought by those anonymous people. At Vienna, they endured months of siege warfare, then fought a massive battle, and many didn't survive to see the outcome. Now let's talk about the myth versus the reality of the Winged Hussars. In popular culture, they've become almost legendary, depicted as invincible super soldiers who single-handedly saved civilization. The reality is more complicated. The Winged Hussars were excellent heavy cavalry, among the best in Europe at the time. But they weren't invincible. They'd lost battles before. They'd been defeated by Swedish, Russian, and Ottoman forces in other conflicts. What made them effective at Vienna wasn't supernatural ability. It was training, discipline, equipment, and most importantly, being used correctly. Sobieski didn't just throw them at the enemy and hope for the best. He positioned them, waited for the right moment, and committed them when they could have maximum impact. That's the difference between effective military leadership and reckless bravado. The Hussars were a tool. Sobieski wielded that tool with precision. The cultural and religious dimensions of Vienna also shaped how the battle was interpreted at the time. This wasn't just a military conflict. It was framed as a clash of civilizations, Christian versus Muslim, West versus East. European propaganda depicted the victory as divine intervention, proof that God favored Christendom over Islam. Ottoman sources framed the defeat as a temporary setback caused by treachery and bad leadership. Both interpretations served political purposes. Leopold and other Christian rulers used Vienna to rally support and justify further wars against the Ottomans. The Ottomans used it to purge leadership and blame individuals rather than systemic problems. Strip away the religious and cultural framing, and what you're left with is a straightforward military conflict. One side had better strategy, better timing, and better execution. They won. The other side made mistakes and lost. That's war. Everything else is interpretation. The Battle of Vienna also highlights the importance of defensive resilience. Kahlenberg's garrison held for 2 months against overwhelming odds. They could have surrendered at any point and probably negotiated decent terms. Instead, they chose to endure starvation, disease, and constant bombardment because they believed relief was coming. That belief was rewarded. If they'd surrendered a week before Sobieski arrived, the entire outcome changes. Vienna falls, the Ottomans fortify it, and the relief force has to besiege a fortified city instead of fighting a field battle. Kahlenberg's stubborn refusal to give up created the conditions for Sobieski's victory. Defense isn't glorious or dramatic, but it's often decisive. Wars are lost when defenders break. Vienna proves that defenders who hold, even when the situation seems hopeless, can win. One final element worth examining is the role of commanders' personal leadership. Sobieski didn't direct the battle from a safe distance. He led the cavalry charge personally, at the front, exposed to all the dangers his troops faced. That kind of leadership was rare even in the 1600s, when commanders often stayed back to maintain overall command and control. But Sobieski understood that cavalry charges require visible leadership at the front. Troops follow leaders they can see. Seeing their king charging ahead inspired the hussars to follow with maximum aggression and commitment. If Sobieski had held back, the charge might have been less decisive, might have faltered if troops hesitated. His personal courage ensured maximum impact. It was risky. If he'd been killed, the Polish army would have lost its commander mid-battle, but he survived, and his leadership made the difference. So what do we take away from Vienna? First, defensive resilience matters. Kahlenberg's garrison held just long enough to enable the relief force to work. Second, timing is everything in warfare. Sobieski arrived at the exact moment when his intervention could be decisive. Third, cavalry is a precision weapon that requires perfect timing and positioning to work. Used correctly, it's devastating. Used poorly, it's wasted. Fourth, logistics and diplomacy shape battles as much as tactics. Leopold's diplomatic efforts assembled the relief force. Ottoman supply problems weakened their siege. Everything connected. Fifth, personal leadership matters. Sobieski led from the front and inspired maximum effort from his troops. That effort broke the Ottoman army. The Siege of Vienna proves that history turns on specific moments and specific decisions. If Vienna had fallen, if Kahlenberg had surrendered, if Sobieski had arrived a week late, if Kara Mustafa had positioned his forces better, everything changes. The Ottoman Empire continues expanding. Central Europe falls under Islamic rule. The balance of power shifts fundamentally, but none of that happened because defenders held, because a relief force arrived in time, because 18,000 cavalry charged at exactly the right moment and shattered an army. One battle, one charge, everything changed. The Ottomans retreated and never returned. Europe remained Christian and independent, and we're still living with the consequences 3.5 centuries later. If this story taught you something about strategy, about the importance of timing, about how one cavalry charge can change the trajectory of civilizations, here's what I need. Hit that like button. Drop a comment telling me what you think about Sobieski's decision to charge or Kahlenberg's defense of the city. Subscribe to this channel because we're telling the stories that history classes skip. The battles that decided everything. The strategies that defied the odds. The moments when everything hung in the balance and someone made the right decision at the right time. No fluff, no oversimplification, just history the way it actually happened. Thanks for watching. Now you know how the Winged Hussars saved Europe, and you know it wasn't a miracle. It was strategy, timing, and the willingness to bet everything on one massive cavalry charge. That's not heroism. That's how wars are won when you understand the battlefield and commit your forces at the decisive moment. You wait, you watch, and when the moment comes, you charge.